We're caught in a trap. I can't walk out.
Hello everyone, this is Mr. Laubach. In this video, I'm going to go over some of the major events and notable people from the civil rights movement during the 1960s. The civil rights movement was a decades-long campaign by African Americans and their like-minded allies to end institutionalized racial discrimination, disenfranchisement, especially in voting, and racial segregation in the United States. The movement has its origins in the Reconstruction era after the Civil War, although it made its largest legislative gains in the 1950s and 1960s after years of direct action and grassroots protests. If you'll look over at this image on the right side, "We Shall Overcome" is a gospel song that was first published in 1900. This song became the anthem of the civil rights movement and was sung in many important marches. The song talks about overcoming racial injustice. Before we start on the movement in the 1960s, let's first go back a little bit earlier. On December 1st, 1955, a white Montgomery City bus driver ordered 42-year-old black seamstress named Rosa Parks to give up her seat to a white passenger. Parks refused by firmly saying one fateful word: no. Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat, and that sparked the Montgomery bus boycott, led by her young minister, 26-year-old Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. The black community supported Parks by boycotting the city buses. The boycott ended 15 months later when the Supreme Court ruled that segregation on public buses was unconstitutional. This certainly was a victory for the civil rights movement. At the beginning of the 1960s, Martin Luther King Jr. was the prominent leader of the civil rights movement. After coming to prominence during the Montgomery bus boycott, King and other clergymen founded the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC. King and the other leaders of the SCLC believed that greater civil rights for African Americans had to be achieved by peaceful means. They preached nonviolence as the pace of the civil rights agitation increased. Younger African Americans wanted to push harder and faster for their rights. In 1960, a group of these young people organized the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee known as SNCC. The leaders of SNCC demanded immediate changes in the country. When it was formed, SNCC included both African American and white students, many of whom attended schools in the North. One of the most effective tactics of civil rights protesters in the early 1960s was the sit-in. Protesters would sit at a lunch counter where African Americans were denied service, and they would refuse to leave until they were served. The sit-in tactics proved quite effective. A great example of one of these sit-ins was when 4 black college students in Greensboro, North Carolina, decided to take action. The 4 sat at a white-only Woolworth lunch counter on February 1st, 1960, and ordered cups of coffee and slices of apple pie. When the waitress refused to take their order, the students remained seated. Their sit-in tactic worked. After losing over $200,000 in business from a variety of similar protests, Greensboro Woolworth desegregated its lunch counter. The Greensboro sit-in energized a wave of student protests across the South. An estimated 70,000 demonstrators held read-ins at libraries, watch-ins at movie theaters, and wade-ins at beaches. In 1961, the dramatic Freedom Rides captured the attention of the nation. In an effort to enforce a Supreme Court ruling that bus stations and their waiting rooms should be integrated, the Congress for Racial Equality, which CORE was short for, organized groups of African American and white volunteers to ride buses through the South. At Anniston, Alabama, the Freedom Riders were met by a white mob that beat them up and burned their bus. More Freedom Riders headed into the South. Many were attacked by mobs or arrested by Southern authorities. Much of this was captured on television. Many Americans were disturbed by the images of shattered buses and bruised and bloodied Freedom Riders. They put pressure on the federal government to protect these civil rights activists. The Kennedy administration ordered federal marshals from the Justice Department to put an end to the attacks on freedom riding buses. With the Freedom Rides, public opinion began to shift in favor of the civil rights movement. Attorney General Robert Kennedy, the brother of President Kennedy, saw to it that the federal government took a larger role in enforcing civil rights laws. In September of 1962, the Attorney General sent 500 U.S. Marshals to escort James Meredith as he enrolled at the now desegregated University of Mississippi, defying both protesters and the governor of that state. In April of 1963, the focus of the civil rights struggle shifted to Birmingham, Alabama. At the time, Birmingham was the largest segregated city in the United States. Eugene Bull Connor, the city's Commissioner of Public Safety, promptly arrested 3,000 demonstrators, including MLK. While in jail, Dr. King wrote his famous Letters from Birmingham Jail, in which he defended civil disobedience as a justified response to unjust segregation laws. Dr. King called upon white clergymen to join him in being extremists for the cause of justice. Bull Connor did not read Dr. King's letter. On May 3rd, his men used clubs, police attack dogs, high-pressure fire hoses to disperse a peaceful demonstration. Public opinion was once again aroused in favor of the civil rights movement. These ugly scenes embarrassed many Americans and fed a growing distaste for attitudes and tactics of Southern segregationists. Concerned about winning re-election and anxious not to alienate the Southern wing of the Democratic Party, President Kennedy moved slowly and cautiously on civil rights issues. In the summer of 1963, he finally sent an ambitious civil rights bill to Congress that would have cut federal funding to states that persisted in promoting racial segregation. On August 28, 1963, the civil rights leaders led the March on Washington. Over 200,000 people walked from the Washington Monument to the Lincoln Memorial. There, Martin Luther King Jr. inspired the gathering with his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. Following the assassination of President Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson was determined to vigorously push forward the civil rights agenda. He sent Congress the most ambitious civil rights legislation since Reconstruction. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 outlawed discrimination based on race, sex, religion, or country of national origin. This comprehensively barred discrimination in public venues. The bill also created the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission to protect employees against workplace bias. Johnson followed this up with the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which outlawed practices such as literacy tests that had been used to keep African Americans from voting. Political momentum for the Voting Rights Act solidified after 3 civil rights activists were murdered in the summer of 1964 because they were helping to register African American voters in Mississippi. Televised footage of violence directed against civil rights protesters continued to undermine the case for segregation. Attacks on the participants of MLK Jr.'s March on Selma in Alabama persuaded many Americans to support Johnson's civil rights legislation. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 overcame most of the remaining legal barriers to African American equality. Despite this, many African Americans still living in poverty, especially those living in northern cities, became angry because the success of the civil rights movement seemed to be having little effect on their lives. Bloody rioting erupted in the Watts neighborhood of Los Angeles in August of 1965. Over the next few years, devastating riots wreaked havoc in cities such as Chicago, Newark, and Detroit. President Johnson appointed the Kerner Commission to determine the causes of this urban upheaval. The Kerner Commission attributed the rioting to poverty and hopelessness in African American neighborhoods. The commission declared that there were 2 Americas, one well-off and white, the other poor and black. One response to the seemingly slow pace of social change was black nationalism. Black nationalists disdained the integrationist goals of the earlier civil rights movement. The Nation of Islam, also known as black Muslims, promulgated a doctrine of racial separation because whites were regarded as racial antagonists. African Americans were encouraged to rely on their own efforts to better themselves. Malcolm X became the most charismatic spokesperson for the Nation of Islam and black nationalism. After Malcolm X began to question some of the racial tenets of the Nation of Islam, he was assassinated by black Muslims in February of 1965. Black nationalism appealed to many younger African American members of SNCC. Stokely Carmichael expelled whites from SNCC and urged African Americans to arm themselves. Carmichael became a prominent exponent of Black Power, which promoted pride in African American history and culture. Many Black Power advocates argued that African Americans should create their own economic and social institution, separating themselves from the white majority. The Black Panthers became a visible symbol of Black Power. Established in San Francisco by Bobby Seale and Huey Newton, the Black Panthers deliberately cultivated a militant image, often prominently displaying their firearms. The Black Panthers set up food programs and black nationalist schools in San Francisco. They also engaged in criminal activity, and several members were killed by police. The violence associated with the Black Panthers eventually ended their social and political effectiveness. We are going to conclude this video by comparing 2 of the more notable civil rights movement leaders in Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. You can see them pictured here. Here is MLK and here is Malcolm X. Dr. King advocated nonviolent protest to challenge Jim Crow segregation. He wanted to create a racially integrated society in which people will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. Dr. King opposed violence, arguing it destroys community and makes brotherhood impossible. During the early 1960s, Malcolm X emerged as a leading voice of an increasingly militant wing of the civil rights movement, embracing black nationalism as an alternative to Dr. King's version of a racially integrated society achieved by peaceful means. Malcolm X exhorted blacks to cast off the shackles of racism by any means necessary, including violence. So in short, the gentlemen agreed on equality and believed that as the major goal. They just had significant differences in the way that equality should be obtained for African Americans.